One of the things that I find super interesting is our continual search for life on other planets. When we do find something, how will we know, is it alive? So you've probably seen we've got all these rovers up on Mars looking around for life, but how will we know life when we see it? Well, the natural inclination is to compare it to what we think is living on our planet. What are the properties that make something living on our planet? In this video, that's what we'll talk about. How do we know when something is alive? Let's get started. So before we can really understand if something's living, it makes sense that we really define some properties. So on our planet Earth, when we think of something that's living, it generally includes these several properties. The first one, of course, is that it can adapt. It undergoes evolutionary adaptation. Think about a giraffe over the years, how it has adapted to be able to eat from really tall trees, right? Its neck is getting longer over time. That is an evolutionary adaptation. Those giraffes that were born with longer necks were able to survive, reach the fruit, so that gene was passed along through several generations. So evolutionary adaptation is a very important property of life. Another interesting thing about life on our planet is that it's highly ordered, right? From plants to sea life to animals, everything has order. So when we're looking for something that's living, we want to make sure that it has some order. Then we also know that things in our life have to process energy. Whether that means they're heterotrophs, they're eating other things, or they're like plants and they're autotrophs, all living things need energy. We also find that life must survive, and to survive, life must reproduce. So we find that living things are also reproducers. They undergo the property of reproduction. The other really interesting thing is that we find living things respond to our environment. We know that we respond, right? As humans, we respond all the time to our environment. It's really hot outside, I need to go inside, or I'll start sweating. So we respond all the time, but we also know that other living things like plants respond to the environment as well. Think about a plant that's responding to light, how it undergoes, as you can see here, a little phototropism. It's moving towards the light source. So living things also respond to environment. Living things also grow, develop, right? So if you are even like something as simple as a bacteria, you have to grow, develop, or you'll perish. So this bacteria undergoes something called binary fission to come into two bacteria. We're growing, developing. Also, one of the little more complicated ones is that living things regulate or show homeostasis. So in my example earlier, I said, if I was hot, I'd start to sweat. Well, birds, other insects as well, have to undergo, birds or other animals have to undergo some sort of homeostasis as well. Living things undergo homeostasis, which is just their ability to maintain or regulate conditions. So that regulation, that maintaining homeostasis is an important property of life. So on our planet, in biology, we consider all of these things essential. So when we're asking the question, is this thing living? It has to have all of these things. It has to show order. It has to evolve, reproduce, use energy, maintain their levels, grow, develop, and respond to environment. All of these properties are essential for living things. So then how are we going to organize this life? Well, biologists have grouped all of these living things into several levels. So we'll start with a very simple level. We'll start with the atom. Yes, there are subatomic particles, but for biology, we're just going to start with atoms. So atoms grouped together will make molecules. So here we see a hydrogen atom, two hydrogen atoms, an oxygen atom. That makes water, of course, a molecule. Then groups of molecules together make larger molecules or macromolecules. This molecule you see here is DNA. But of course, you know, we also have protein. These are large molecules, carbs, lipids. Those macromolecules would make up organelles. Now, if it's a eukaryotic organism, right, like humans, you would see an organelle here, like this mitochondria that has a membrane. Not all cells, not all living things have these membrane-bound organelles like a mitochondria. So then organelles will make up, of course, cells. And here you can see a typical animal cell with all of these little organelles in there. Things like bacteria, they do have cells, right? They're a living thing, but you won't see as many of these little organelles in there. So what do cells do? Groups of cells together make up tissues. This particular tissue is a bunch of muscle cells working together, so this is some muscle tissue. And we know that when we look at tissues working together, they will form an organ. So we can probably then guess that this muscle tissue we're looking at here is cardiac muscle tissue that makes up the heart. So then the next level, of course, would be these organs grouped together, and they group into a organ system. This organ system we're looking at here would be the circulatory. Some people say the cardiovascular system. So it's a group of organs working together for similar functions. And then all the systems in our body, right? The cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, the muscular system, all that together would make up, of course, an organism like us. Now, I've given you an example for an animal. We could have an example for a plant. Plant has tissue, some xylem and phloem, right, where the water and food move through. They have organs. What would be a plant organ? Oh, a leaf, right? And then they have systems, and then you could have an organism that's a plant. So this is just one example, or several examples, of how we would organize for animals. Okay, well, we don't just stop there, actually, because we can group together organisms when we get into things like ecology. So a group of organisms we call a population. So here you've got a population of dogs, right? Population of canines. When you have several populations together, we call that a community. So all these populations, you got a population of dogs and cats and looks like some rabbits there. Those make up a community. Then when you consider the other factors, right, the temperature and the soil and all of the rainfall, that will make up a particular ecosystem. So when you include the living and the non-living things, we get this ecosystem. And then finally, all the ecosystems on our planet, right, make up the biosphere, the sphere of life, the circle of life on our planet. So hopefully this lets you put into some sort of framework in your mind how life is organized. So life can further be classified, okay? So how do we classify life? If we find something living, if we're on Mars and we find something living, the first question people are going to ask is, what is that? What's it like on Earth? How do you compare it? Well, on Earth, we've set up 3 domains of life. Domain bacteria, you probably hear a lot about bacteria, E. coli, staph, right? There's these small unicellular, right, one cell. And domain bacteria is very diverse. There's a lot of unicellular living bacteria on our planet. And it's all around us. It's everywhere. It's inside us. It's on us. It's living in the soil. It's in the air. Domain bacteria is everywhere. Another really interesting one is domain archaea, or some people say domain archaea. If you look at the root of this, right, you think like archaeology. These are pretty old. They evolved a long time ago. Some of them are extremophiles. They live in extreme conditions on our Earth. And if you look at one, you might say, oh, let's just put that in bacteria. But when we look at the DNA, when we actually look at what makes up the genetic material of these, we find they're quite different. So archaea, or archaea, is in its own domain. Okay, then the other big domain The one that we fall in is domain eukarya. And domain eukarya really is divided into several kingdoms. Kingdom Plantae, you can imagine that's the plants, right? Kingdom Plantae. Then Kingdom Animalia, that's where we fall. That's where the elephants fall. That's where insects fall, believe it or not. You might not think of a bug as an animal, but it actually is. It's in Kingdom Animalia. Kingdom Protista, there's actually several kingdoms. Notice I put a little S here. There's lots of Protista kingdoms. A lot of people have trouble with this one. Protists or Protista are small little living creatures like here, right? Like a paramecium, an amoeba. So they're a little more complex than when we think of bacteria because they're in domain eukarya. They share our traits with animals and plants. And then finally, Kingdom Fungi. When you think of mushrooms, yeast, things like this, that all falls into Kingdom Fungi. Okay, so just to review this, we've got three domains: domain bacteria, domain archaea, and eukarya. Within eukarya, I've given you several kingdoms: the plants, the animals, the fungi, and the protists. So let's try to wrap this up by seeing how we would organize these systems. We need to make sense out of this diversity of life. When we find something on Mars, what's it related to? Okay, maybe it's in this domain, but is it closer to an insect? Unlikely. What's it like? So let's organize into these domains. And to do that, we're going to start with my puppy, Gracie. And you know Gracie here, my doggie. Where would she go in life's hierarchy? So let's start with domain. That's the largest. So when we're looking at domain, we're going to go right into eukarya, right? She is a eukaryote, domain eukarya. And what else falls in domain eukarya, right? So of course my dog, but also bears, fish. We talked about the paramecium, elephants, fungi, plants. That's wide. That's a big group. So let's narrow it down. Let's focus in on the animals, right? So we're going to get rid of the plants, the fungi. Let's focus in on the animals. So we're still including the dogs, the bears, the fish, insects. You remember butterfly, I told you, starfish in the ocean. Those are all animals. So this is a kingdom. So we go domain, kingdom. Well, let's focus in a little more. Let's focus on only the ones that are in a phylum Chordata, right? They have a dorsal nerve cord, right? Think of like a spine, a nerve cord. So all of these things, look what we lost, right? We know that butterfly don't have this dorsal nerve cord. So we now are including everything that does. That's the phylum. So domain, kingdom, phylum. Then, let's focus in on the mammals, right? So we're going to lose the fish, we're going to lose the frog, but we're going to keep the mammals. This would be our class. Just want to point out, yeah, dolphins are mammals. All right, so here's my dog. We've moved up, right? Continuing to narrow down. Now we're into the mammals. Moving up, we get to order. So we're looking for carnivores, things that eat meat. All right, so we got our bear, we got my dog still. So we've gone domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order. Notice we're getting smaller as we go up. The next level of organization would be the family. So here we're looking at sort of the Canidae family, which you might think of as canines, right? So that's going to include the dog and the fox. And this is actually supposed to be a raccoon dog, right? Look it up. Google it. It's a really interesting canine. Then move up, genus. The Canis genus is what Gracie's in. And that also includes the fox. But then when we go to one specific species, Grace is Canis lupus. And we call this binomial nomenclature because binomial, two names, nomenclature, how we name something. So Canis lupus is the genus and species of my dog, Gracie. So if you're putting this all together, if you're trying to organize all of this, I use a mnemonic device. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. I think when I was in lower school, in elementary school, to use this device. Dear King Paul cried out for good soup. That might help you. Dear King Paul cried out for good soup. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. That might help you remember the order of how we organize systems. So why do we do this? We do this so that when we find a new species, maybe on Mars, who knows, that we can then classify it. What is it closest to? Now, this particular graph here, right, you've been using characteristics. Today, to classify these organisms, we're really going to look at the genetic material. So, yes, we'll look at what it looks like, but with the prime example of our dolphin, you might not say, oh, dolphin goes in the mammals, right? But when we really look at the characteristics, we start analyzing the DNA, we can truly consider how these different living things on our planet should be organized. And there's my dog right at the top, where the dogs should be, right at the top with the species. So hopefully this video helped you understand a little bit more about life. All right, so back to Mars. Where do we go? Well, it's unlikely that we're going to find some large intelligent species on Mars, but the life we find, if we find some, will probably be much more difficult to discern. That's why it's important that we have these skills, that we can classify life, and that we start to understand it from its very basic origins.